The year was 1274, and the morning mist clung to the shores of Tsushima like a burial shroud. 80 samurai warriors stood on the beach at Komoda, their katanas gleaming in the pale dawn light, facing an impossible sight on the horizon. 900 Mongol warships stretched across the sea like a dark plague, carrying 20,000 of the most battle-hardened killers the world had ever known. These weren't pirates or raiders. This was the unstoppable war machine of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the man who had crushed empires from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. And now, his hungry gaze had turned toward 4 isolated islands that the Mongols called the Land of the Rising Sun. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of history's most savage demonstrations of cultural collision, where ancient codes of honor met brutal efficiency, where individual heroism crashed against organized slaughter, and where the very concept of warfare would be redefined in blood and screams. The Battle of Tsushima wasn't just a military engagement. It was the moment when Japan's isolated warrior culture collided headfirst with an empire that had perfected the art of systematic extermination. But this massacre didn't begin with swords or arrows. It began 7 years earlier with something far more civilized and infinitely more ominous. A letter, a simple piece of parchment that would seal the fate of thousands and reshape the destiny of an entire nation. The messenger who delivered it had no idea he was carrying a death warrant for an entire way of life. Picture this scene unfolding in 1267. A lone Korean vessel approaches the Japanese coast, its hull cutting through waters that had never carried foreign threats. On board, a diplomat clutches a document bearing the imperial seal of the most powerful man on earth. The letter's contents were deceptively simple, written with the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. From ancient times, rulers of small nations have sought to maintain friendly relations with those of great empires. We, having conquered all of China and Korea, now extend our hand toward your shores. Send ambassadors, pay tribute, or face the consequences. The Kamakura shogunate, Japan's military government, received this ultimatum and made a decision that would echo through centuries. They did something no other kingdom in the Mongol path had ever dared. They ignored it completely. Not a polite refusal, not a diplomatic counter-proposal, not even an acknowledgement that the message had been received. Absolute, contemptuous silence. For 6 years, Mongol messengers continued crossing the treacherous waters between Korea and Japan, each carrying increasingly threatening demands. 6 years of opportunities for diplomacy, 6 years of chances to avoid what was coming. But Japan's response never changed. To the most powerful empire in human history, they essentially said, "We don't want your friendship, we don't need your trade, and we certainly won't bow to your authority." This wasn't mere arrogance. This was Japan's complete inability to comprehend what they were facing. The island nation had never been invaded in its entire history. Never. Not once had foreign boots touched Japanese soil in anger. The samurai were formidable warriors, absolutely, but their experience was limited to internal conflicts between Japanese clans. They fought according to the Bushido Code, where battles began with formal challenges, where warriors announced their names and lineages before combat, where single duels determined outcomes. The Mongols had never heard of Bushido, and they wouldn't have cared if they had. While Japan maintained its proud silence, something unprecedented was taking shape in Korean shipyards. Kublai Khan was assembling an invasion force that would dwarf anything the world had seen. 900 vessels of various sizes, from massive troop transports to swift attack craft, 23,000 hardened warriors, 15,000 Mongols and Chinese veterans of countless campaigns, plus 8,000 Korean soldiers forced into service. These weren't honorable knights seeking glorious single combat. They were professional killers who had refined warfare into a science. They used poisoned arrows without hesitation, attacked in coordinated masses rather than individual duels. and carried weapons that would seem like dark magic to Japanese defenders. Most terrifying of all were their explosive devices, iron spheres packed with gunpowder that could be hurled by catapults or thrown by hand. When these bombs detonated, metal fragments would tear through flesh and bone, while the thunderous sound alone could drive horses mad with terror. Japan had no conception of such weapons. While the Mongols prepared their technological superiority, samurai warriors continued practicing with their traditional katanas, perfecting their archery, and meditating on concepts of honor and dignified death. They had no idea that honor was about to become completely irrelevant. The invasion fleet departed Korea in October 1274, its destination carefully chosen for maximum strategic impact. Tsushima Island wasn't selected randomly. This small piece of land between Korea and Japan's main island of Kyushu served as the perfect stepping stone. Control Tsushima, and you controlled the gateway to Japan itself. From this forward base, the Mongols could launch their final assault on the Japanese heartland. Defending this crucial island were approximately 80 permanent samurai, under the command of So Sukekuni, the military governor. 80 warriors to protect an entire island, along with their families, servants, and the farmers who worked the rice fields that sustained their community. These men had wives who loved them, children who looked up to them, and a centuries-old way of life they were sworn to protect. On November 18th, the watchers on Tsushima's cliffs saw something that transformed their blood to ice water. The horizon was darkening, not with storm clouds, but with sails. Hundreds upon hundreds of sails, stretching as far as the eye could see. The Mongol armada appeared like a nightmare made manifest, a floating city of death bearing down on their isolated home. So Sukekuni climbed to the highest observation point available and began counting ships. 10, 20, 50, 100. The numbers became meaningless. There were simply too many to count, too many to comprehend. Basic mathematics told the story with brutal clarity. 80 defenders against thousands of invaders. The odds weren't just unfavorable, they were mathematically impossible. The governor faced a choice that would define everything that followed. 3 options lay before him, each carrying its own moral weight. First, surrender immediately and hope for mercy from conquerors known for their occasional pragmatism. Second, flee to Kyushu with his men and warn the mainland authorities, preserving their lives to fight another day. Third, stay and fight a battle they absolutely could not win. Here was the fundamental question that would haunt Japanese culture for centuries. What matters more, preserving life or preserving honor? Sukekuni and his warriors knew with absolute certainty that choosing to fight meant choosing to die. There was no question about the outcome, no hope of victory, no possibility of survival. But if they fled without resistance, Tsushima would fall, without the Mongols suffering a single casualty. Worse, the shogunate on Kyushu would have no idea of the true scale of the threat bearing down on them. A handful of pirates was one thing. 20,000 professional soldiers was something entirely different. If no one fought, if no resistance was offered, the authorities on the mainland might assume they faced a minor raid rather than a full-scale invasion. They might not mobilize the entire country's military resources. They might not understand that Japan itself was at stake. Sukekuni made his decision with the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. They would stay, they would fight, and they would die. But in dying, they would send a message that would take days to reach Kyushu, but would be unmistakably clear when it arrived. Japan was under attack by an unstoppable force that required every available warrior to resist. The Mongol fleet began its approach to Komoda Beach as the morning mist lifted, revealing the full horror of what the Japanese defenders faced. This wasn't a collection of individual ships carrying independent warriors. This was a coordinated military machine operating with the precision of 1,000-piece clockwork. Landing craft hit the beach in waves, disgorging soldiers who moved with the disciplined efficiency of men who had performed this operation dozens of times before. The 80 samurai prepared for battle according to traditions that stretched back generations. They donned their ancestral armor, sharpened their family swords, and prepared to die as their fathers and grandfathers had taught them. But nothing in their training, nothing in their cultural memory had prepared them for what they were about to encounter. This was the moment when two completely different concepts of warfare collided with devastating results. The samurai expected individual combat, personal challenges, the opportunity to demonstrate their skill and courage in single duels that would determine the outcome of the broader conflict. The Mongols expected to execute a tactical operation with maximum efficiency and minimum casualties to their own forces. What followed would be less a battle than a systematic demonstration of how quickly ancient traditions could be rendered obsolete by superior technology, numbers, and tactical innovation. The isolated island of Tsushima was about to witness one of history's most one-sided massacres, a bloodbath so complete that it would redefine Japanese understanding of warfare forever. The stage was set for 3 hours of unimaginable brutality that would echo through Japanese consciousness for 7 centuries to come. The first samurai to charge into this nightmare was Takazaki Suenaga, a warrior whose name would survive the slaughter only because he lived to tell the tale. He spurred his horse forward across the sand, following traditions that had governed Japanese warfare for centuries. He shouted his name at the top of his lungs, announced his lineage and achievements, and challenged the Mongol forces to send forth a worthy opponent for honorable single combat. The response was not what any code of Bushido had prepared him for. Instead of a single warrior stepping forward to accept his challenge, the entire Mongol line responded as one organism. Hundreds of arrows darkened the sky like a plague of locusts, each one aimed with deadly precision. Suenaga received 3 near-simultaneous impacts that changed everything he understood about warfare. One arrow punched through his shoulder armor, another buried itself deep in his thigh, and the third killed his horse beneath him. As he crashed to the sand, bleeding and confused, Suenaga experienced something no samurai had ever encountered: the complete absence of honor in combat. Where was the individual duel? Where was the respectful acknowledgement of his challenge? Where was the mutual recognition of warrior courage? None of it existed. The Mongols simply identified a target and eliminated it with ruthless efficiency. This was the moment when Japan's entire martial culture confronted its own obsolescence. The Mongols weren't interested in proving individual valor or demonstrating personal skill. They were interested in winning, period. Every arrow that flew, every formation that moved, every tactical decision that was made served one purpose: complete victory with minimum cost to themselves. As Suenaga lay wounded and helpless, Mongol soldiers advanced toward him with weapons drawn. He was about to become another casualty in what the invaders considered routine battlefield cleanup. But samurai loyalty ran deeper than personal survival. Shirai Shimishiyasu, one of Suenaga's companions, witnessed his friend's predicament and made an instant decision that epitomized everything noble and tragic about the warrior code. Mishiyasu spurred his own horse directly toward the Mongol line, screaming challenges and insults, desperately trying to draw attention away from the fallen Suenaga. The Mongols responded exactly as they had before, turning their weapons toward this new threat and cutting him down with mechanical precision. But those crucial seconds of distraction allowed Suenaga to drag himself beyond the immediate killing zone, making him one of the few Japanese witnesses to survive what followed. The slaughter that engulfed Komoda Beach defied every assumption the samurai had about warfare. These 80 warriors had trained their entire lives for combat, but they had trained for a completely different kind of fighting. They expected individual duels where superior skill and courage could overcome numerical disadvantages. Instead, they faced something that resembled a military machine more than a collection of human opponents. When a samurai charged forward seeking single combat, 10 Mongols would surround him instantly. They attacked from every angle simultaneously, showing no interest in fair play or honorable engagement. There were no dramatic sword duels, no opportunities for tactical brilliance, no moments where individual heroism could turn the tide. There was only systematic, efficient killing. The sound that began to fill the air above the clash of weapons was something no Japanese warrior had ever heard in combat. The high-pitched whistle of incoming artillery. The Mongol ships offshore had positioned catapults that could hurl explosive devices deep into the defenders' positions. These weren't simple stone projectiles that the samurai might have understood. These were technological innovations that seemed to harness the power of thunder itself. The iron spheres packed with gunpowder created explosions that shook the earth beneath the warriors' feet. When they detonated, fragments of metal flew in every direction like invisible knives, tearing through armor and flesh with indiscriminate violence. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Horses that had never heard such sounds went mad with terror, throwing their riders and fleeing in blind panic. Some of the older samurai, men who had never experienced anything louder than the clash of steel on steel, believed they were witnessing supernatural intervention. The explosions seemed like divine thunder, the work of angry gods rather than human technology. This interpretation was both completely wrong and psychologically understandable. How else could isolated island warriors comprehend weapons that could kill from a distance with fire and metal fragments? But these weren't divine manifestations. They were the products of a civilization that had been perfecting military technology through constant warfare across continents. The difference between the Mongol Empire and isolated Japan wasn't just numerical or tactical. It was technological, representing the gap between a culture that had fought only itself and an empire that had conquered half the known world. So Sukekuni watched his men fall one by one, each death confirming what mathematics had already made clear. The Mongol formation advanced across the beach like an unstoppable tide, leaving bodies in its wake. There was no dramatic turning point, no moment where courage or skill could change the outcome. There was only the steady, methodical elimination of resistance. Japanese tradition offered two honorable responses to inevitable defeat. A warrior could die fighting with his sword in his hand, or he could perform seppuku, ritual suicide that preserved dignity while denying enemies the satisfaction of execution. Sukekuni chose neither of these options. Instead, he made a decision that transcended both practical strategy and traditional honor. He drew his katana and charged directly toward the center of the Mongol formation. This wasn't tactical brilliance or emotional breakdown. This was a calculated choice to die in the most visible, dramatic way possible. If his death was inevitable, it would serve as a beacon that could be seen from the ships offshore, a signal that Japanese resistance had fought to the last man. 23 surviving samurai followed their commander in this final, hopeless charge. They weren't seeking victory or even tactical advantage. They were creating a message written in blood and sacrifice that would be impossible to misinterpret. They screamed their war cries, raised their ancestral swords, and threw themselves against a wall of shields and spears that had stopped far more numerous armies across 2 continents. None of them survived the encounter. The Battle of Komoda lasted less than 3 hours from first contact to final silence. 80 samurai lay dead on the sand, their blood mixing with the tide. The Mongol casualties were minimal, perhaps 100 men, possibly fewer. For the invaders, this hadn't been a real battle at all. It had been a brief morning's work, a minor obstacle cleared away before the serious business of invasion could begin. But something crucial had been accomplished in those 3 hours of slaughter. The message that Sukekuni had tried to send with his death had been received. Before the fighting began, he had managed to dispatch a messenger who escaped the island in a small boat, carrying news that would reach the mainland authorities within days. The information this survivor brought to Kyushu was terrifying in its implications. This wasn't a raid by a few hundred pirates. This was a full-scale invasion by thousands of professional soldiers equipped with weapons that seemed to command the forces of nature itself. The isolated island of Tsushima had fallen completely, its defenders annihilated to the last man. The Mongol fleet now controlled its first piece of Japanese territory. 20,000 warriors had established a beachhead from which they could launch the next phase of their campaign. The gateway to Japan had been forced open with brutal efficiency, and the real invasion was just beginning. As the sun set on November 18th, Mongol soldiers walked among the Japanese dead, collecting trophies and conducting the grim accounting that followed every victory. They had established their reputation for thorough brutality, but they had also encountered something unexpected. These island warriors had fought with a desperate courage that impressed even hardened veterans of continental campaigns. The Mongols began preparing for the next phase of their operation, but they now understood they weren't facing a collection of primitive islanders. They were confronting warriors who would choose death over surrender, men who would fight impossible odds rather than abandon their posts. This knowledge would prove both tactically valuable and psychologically unsettling as the invasion continued. The systematic butchery that followed the battle revealed the true face of Mongol warfare, a calculated cruelty designed not just to eliminate resistance, but to terrorize future opponents into submission. What the invaders did to the bodies of the fallen samurai went far beyond military necessity. It was psychological warfare refined through decades of conquest, a deliberate strategy to ensure that word of their methods would spread faster than their armies. The Mongols didn't simply kill their enemies and move on. They understood that fear was a weapon more powerful than any sword or arrow. As the last echoes of combat faded from Komoda Beach, the real horror began. Mongol soldiers moved among the Japanese dead with the methodical precision of butchers, but their work served purposes that transcended mere battlefield cleanup. They began collecting ears, not as barbaric trophies, but as administrative records. The Mongol military machine operated with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed modern accountants. Each severed ear represented a confirmed kill, a quantifiable unit of victory that could be tallied, recorded, and reported up the chain of command. This wasn't savagery for its own sake. This was industrialized death, warfare reduced to statistical data points. But the ear collection was only the beginning. The Mongols had perfected techniques of terror that they had refined across continents, methods that transformed military victory into psychological domination. They gathered the heads of the fallen samurai, arranging them in neat pyramids on the beach, like grotesque monuments to their efficiency. These displays weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated messages designed to be seen by anyone who might consider resistance. The most horrific innovation came when the invaders turned their attention to the civilian population. As news of the battle's outcome spread across Tsushima, families who had hidden in forests and mountain caves began attempting to flee the island. Small boats filled with women, children, and elderly villagers tried to slip away under cover of darkness, hoping to reach the safety of Kyushu before the Mongols could stop them. Most never made it past the harbour. Mongol patrol boats intercepted these desperate refugees with ruthless efficiency, dragging them back to shore for a fate that would haunt Japanese nightmares for generations. The invaders had developed a signature method of dealing with civilian populations that served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. They herded hundreds of captured civilians onto the beach, sorting them with the casual efficiency of livestock traders. Women, children, elderly farmers, Buddhist monks, Shinto priests, all were subjected to the same systematic processing. What followed was a demonstration of calculated sadism that transformed human beings into instruments of psychological warfare. The Mongols produced lengths of rope and sharp metal tools, then began the process that would become their most infamous trademark. They pierced the palms of their captives' hands, driving the rope through the wounds and binding groups of prisoners together in long, agonizing chains. But this wasn't the end of their torment. It was only the preparation. These human chains were then dragged to the Mongol warships and suspended from the sides of the vessels like living banners. The prisoners hung there in full view, their blood dripping into the sea, their screams carrying across the water. Some died quickly from their wounds or from shock. Others lingered for hours, swaying with the motion of the ships, their agony visible to anyone watching from shore. The strategic brilliance of this atrocity was as horrifying as its execution. When the Mongol fleet moved to its next target, observers on distant beaches would see the approaching ships decorated with human suffering. Before the first arrow was fired or the first sword drawn, defenders would understand exactly what awaited them if they chose resistance over surrender. This wasn't random cruelty. This was terror as a military tactic, refined through years of conquest into a science of intimidation. The Mongols understood that an enemy who surrendered without fighting cost them nothing. An enemy who fought to the death, even unsuccessfully, cost them men, time, and resources. By ensuring that stories of their methods spread ahead of their armies, they could often secure surrender without battle. The civilian massacre continued throughout the night and into the following day. Those not selected for the ship displays faced other fates designed to maximize the psychological impact on future targets. Some were executed in elaborate public ceremonies, their deaths choreographed for maximum visibility. Others were subjected to tortures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, their screams intended to carry across the water to nearby islands. The Mongols maintained detailed records of these activities, not from sadistic pleasure, but from military professionalism. They documented which methods produced the fastest surrenders, which displays of force generated the most terror, which combination of violence and mercy achieved optimal results. This was warfare as a science, with human suffering as its primary research material. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Tsushima massacre was how routine it had become for the Mongol forces. These weren't soldiers driven mad by battle or consumed by bloodlust. They were professionals executing standard operating procedures that had been refined across dozens of campaigns. The systematic nature of their cruelty revealed something more disturbing than random violence. This was organized, deliberate, and considered normal. Contemporary accounts describe Mongol officers walking among the carnage with the detached interest of inspectors reviewing a construction project. They evaluated the effectiveness of different terror techniques, made notes for future operations, and discussed tactical improvements with the calm professionalism of military engineers. The human cost of their methods was simply another factor in their strategic calculations. As the second day dawned over Tsushima, the island had been transformed into something unrecognizable. What had been a peaceful farming community with ancient temples and rice paddies had become a charnel house designed to send a message across the sea. The Mongols weren't just conquering territory, they were rewriting the rules of warfare itself, demonstrating that traditional concepts of honor and mercy were luxuries that isolated island cultures could no longer afford. The few Japanese who managed to escape the island carried tales that seemed too horrible to believe. They spoke of weapons that commanded thunder, of enemies who fought without honor, of civilians transformed into decorations for warships. These survivors would reach Kyushu with accounts that challenged every assumption about warfare that Japanese culture had developed over centuries. But the Mongols weren't finished with their demonstration. Having secured Tsushima as a forward base, they began preparing for the next phase of their campaign. The island's strategic value wasn't just geographical. It now served as a workshop where they could refine their methods before facing larger Japanese forces on the mainland. They established permanent camps among the ruins of Japanese villages, using the island's resources to resupply their fleet while continuing their psychological warfare campaign. Mongol patrols scoured every corner of Tsushima, hunting down any remaining civilians who might have escaped their initial sweep. These operations weren't driven by military necessity. The island was already completely under their control. They were practicing, perfecting their techniques for the larger battles to come. The treatment of prisoners during this phase revealed the systematic nature of Mongol cruelty. Captives weren't simply killed or enslaved. They were processed through a deliberate program designed to extract maximum intelligence value before their eventual disposal. Interrogation techniques that had been developed across decades of continental warfare were applied with scientific precision. The Mongols had learned that different populations responded to different forms of pressure. They tested various combinations of physical pain, psychological manipulation, and threats to family members, carefully documenting which approaches yielded the most reliable information from Japanese subjects. This wasn't torture for its own sake. This was intelligence gathering refined into a brutal art form. Those prisoners who survived the interrogation process faced fates that served the broader strategic goal of terrorizing future opponents. Some were mutilated in specific ways designed to send clear messages about the consequences of resistance. Others were kept alive as living examples of Mongol power, their suffering intended to demoralize any Japanese forces that might encounter them. The most valuable prisoners from a propaganda perspective were those with status or recognition in Japanese society. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests received special attention, not because of any religious animosity, but because their treatment would have maximum psychological impact on deeply religious Japanese communities. The systematic desecration of religious figures served to demonstrate that no aspect of Japanese culture was beyond Mongol reach. As reports of these atrocities filtered back to the mainland, they created exactly the psychological effect the Mongols intended. Japanese communities that had never seen foreign enemies began experiencing a form of terror that was entirely new to their isolated culture. The very concepts that had defined their understanding of warfare, honor, individual combat, respect for religious authority, were being systematically destroyed before they even faced the invaders directly. The Mongol occupation of Tsushima lasted for several days, during which the invaders perfected their methods while preparing for the next phase of their campaign. They weren't in any hurry to advance. Every day spent refining their terror techniques was an investment that would pay dividends when they faced larger Japanese forces. The island had become a laboratory for psychological warfare, with its surviving population serving as unwilling test subjects. When the Mongol fleet finally prepared to depart Tsushima, they left behind a scene that defied comprehension. The island's Buddhist temples had been systematically desecrated, their sacred artifacts destroyed or defiled. Rice paddies that had fed families for generations were contaminated with corpses. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and rubble. But the physical destruction was only part of their message. The Mongols ensured that evidence of their methods would be impossible to hide or minimize. They wanted survivors. They needed witnesses who could carry accounts of what they had seen to the next target. The terror they had created on Tsushima was designed to precede them, softening resistance before their ships even appeared on the horizon. The strategic genius of this approach became clear as the fleet prepared to sail toward Iki Island, their next objective. Intelligence reports indicated that news of Tsushima's fate had already reached the defenders there. Some had fled immediately upon hearing the accounts. Others were reportedly arguing among themselves about whether resistance or surrender offered better chances of survival. This was exactly what the Mongols had intended. By investing time and effort in creating maximum terror on Tsushima, they were reducing the resistance they would face on subsequent targets. Each atrocity served a calculated purpose in their broader campaign strategy. They weren't just conquering islands. They were conquering the Japanese capacity for resistance itself. The psychological warfare that the Mongols had perfected on Tsushima was about to be tested on a larger scale. As their blood-stained fleet approached Iki Island on November 20th, the defenders there had already received fragmentary reports of what had transpired on the previous target. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of facing an enemy that had transformed cruelty into a military science. Iki Island was larger than Tsushima, with a more substantial population and stronger defenses. Approximately 120 samurai served under Taira no Kagetaka, a seasoned military commander who understood the mathematics of their situation all too well. Unlike Susukakuni, who had faced the Mongol threat with limited intelligence, Kagetaka possessed detailed accounts of what had happened at Komoda Beach. The reports that reached Iki painted a picture that challenged everything the samurai thought they knew about warfare. Witnesses spoke of enemies who fought without honor, weapons that commanded thunder and lightning, and most disturbing of all, the systematic torture and mutilation of civilians. These weren't the exaggerated tales of panicked refugees. They came from reliable sources, including a few samurai who had escaped the initial massacre. Kagetaka faced the same impossible choice that had confronted his counterpart on Tsushima, but with one crucial difference: he had time to prepare. The Mongol fleet's approach gave him precious days to organize his defenses, evacuate non-combatants, and choose the terrain where his men would make their stand. He could create defensive positions that might allow his smaller force to inflict significant casualties on the invaders. The strategic question that consumed his thoughts went beyond simple military tactics. Every hour spent preparing defenses was an hour that could be used to evacuate civilians to the mainland. Every samurai who died on Iki was one fewer defender available for the inevitable assault on Kyushu itself. From a purely rational perspective, withdrawal made perfect sense. But Kagetaka understood something that pure military logic couldn't capture. If Iki fell without resistance, the Mongols would have two forward bases from which to launch their assault on Japan proper. More importantly, they would have demonstrated that Japanese forces could be intimidated into abandoning their posts without a fight. The psychological impact of such a precedent would reverberate throughout the entire defensive campaign. He made his decision with full knowledge of its consequences. They would stay, they would fight, and they would die. But their deaths would serve a purpose beyond mere honor. Every Mongol casualty they inflicted would be one fewer enemy facing the defenders of Kyushu. Every hour they delayed the invasion was time for the mainland forces to prepare. Their sacrifice would be tactical as well as symbolic. The preparations that followed revealed how quickly Japanese military thinking was adapting to this new form of warfare. Instead of preparing for the traditional individual combats that had defined samurai culture, Kagetaka organized his forces for coordinated group tactics. He studied the accounts from Tsushima, analyzing every detail of how the Mongols had achieved such overwhelming victory. The defensive positions he established reflected this new understanding. Rather than meeting the invaders on open ground where their superior numbers and coordinated tactics would prove decisive, he positioned his men in carefully chosen strongpoints throughout the island's interior. Narrow passes, fortified hilltops, and dense forests would force the Mongols to fight on terms that minimized their numerical advantage. But Kagetaka also understood that defensive preparations alone wouldn't be sufficient. The Mongol fleet carried those terrible explosive devices that could shatter traditional fortifications. Their coordinated archery volleys could suppress defenders from considerable distances. Most importantly, their psychological warfare tactics were designed specifically to break the will of isolated garrison forces. The evacuation of civilians presented its own horrific dilemmas. The accounts from Tsushima made clear what fate awaited non-combatants who fell into Mongol hands. But the boats available for evacuation could carry only a fraction of Iki's population. Who would be saved, and who would be left behind to face whatever horrors the invaders might devise? Families were torn apart by these impossible decisions. Elderly grandparents insisted that younger family members take the available spaces on evacuation boats. Mothers faced the choice between saving themselves and their children, or staying to face death together. Buddhist monks debated whether their spiritual obligations required them to remain with those who couldn't escape. The civilian evacuation became a microcosm of the larger moral crisis that the Mongol invasion had created. Traditional Japanese society was built on concepts of duty, loyalty, and mutual obligation that had never been tested by systematic extermination. The approaching fleet represented something beyond their cultural framework, an enemy that recognized no moral boundaries whatsoever. As the evacuation boats slipped away from Iki under cover of darkness, those left behind faced a weight that tested human endurance to its limits. They could see the Mongol fleet on the horizon, growing larger each day. They could observe the invaders' methodical preparations, the organization of landing craft, the positioning of those terrible catapults that hurled explosive death. The psychological pressure of this waiting period was as deliberate as everything else in the Mongol campaign. They weren't approaching Iki with maximum speed because they didn't need to. Time was on their side. Every day that passed allowed fear to grow among the defenders, weakening their resolve before the first blow was struck. When the Mongol assault finally began, it demonstrated how thoroughly they had learned from their Tsushima experience. The bombardment that preceded their landing was more intense and systematic than anything they had used before. The explosive devices didn't just target defensive positions. They specifically aimed at locations where civilians might be hiding, sending a clear message that no one would be spared. The landing itself revealed new innovations in their terror tactics. Along with the traditional displays of severed heads and human decorations on their ships, the Mongols had brought survivors from Tsushima. These broken prisoners were paraded before the Iki defenders as living examples of what resistance would achieve. Some had been mutilated in ways designed to maximize psychological impact. Others had been kept alive specifically to demonstrate Mongol power over life and death. The battle that followed was everything Kagetaka had expected, and worse. His defensive preparations proved partially effective, forcing the Mongols to pay a higher price for their victory than they had on Tsushima. Japanese archers positioned in elevated positions managed to inflict significant casualties during the initial assault. Coordinated counterattacks from multiple directions disrupted Mongol formations and created moments of tactical confusion. But these tactical successes only delayed the inevitable outcome. The Mongol force was simply too large, too well equipped, and too experienced for any island garrison to defeat. Their explosive devices systematically destroyed Japanese strongpoints. Their coordinated archery volleys suppressed defensive positions with overwhelming firepower. Most importantly, their psychological warfare began to take its toll on defenders who had never faced anything like it. The systematic nature of the Mongol advance was perhaps more demoralizing than their raw firepower. They moved across Iki like a force of nature, methodically clearing each defensive position before moving to the next. There was no randomness, no confusion, no opportunity for the kind of individual heroics that might have turned the tide in traditional Japanese warfare. Kagetaka's final stand came at a small fortress in the island's interior, where he had gathered the survivors of his scattered defensive positions. The structure was wooden, never designed to withstand siege weapons, but it represented the last organized resistance on Iki. As Mongol forces surrounded the position, the Japanese commander faced the same choice that had confronted So Sukekuni days earlier. But Kagetaka had witnessed something his predecessor had not. He had seen how effectively coordinated resistance could inflict casualties on the invaders. His final charge wasn't just a gesture of defiance, it was a calculated decision to ensure that every remaining Japanese life would cost the Mongols as dearly as possible. The 20 surviving samurai who followed him into that last desperate assault weren't seeking honor or glory. They were conducting a tactical operation designed to maximize enemy casualties while sending an unmistakable message to observers on the mainland. When Mongol soldiers later counted their dead, they found that this small island garrison had killed nearly as many invaders as much larger forces had managed on the continental campaigns. Iki fell in a single day, but that day had cost the Mongols hundreds of casualties and demonstrated that Japanese resistance was adapting to their methods. The systematic brutality that followed the battle was more extensive than what had occurred on Tsushima, partly because the larger population provided more opportunities for their terror tactics, but also because they had encountered more effective resistance than expected. The processing of prisoners on Iki revealed new refinements in Mongol psychological warfare techniques. They had observed which methods produced the most terror on Tsushima and had developed more sophisticated approaches for their second target. The human decorations that adorned their fleet when it departed Iki were more elaborate, more visible, and more specifically designed to demoralize the next set of defenders they would encounter. But something had changed in the dynamic between invader and defender. The Mongols had achieved their tactical objectives on both islands, but they had also learned that Japanese resistance was not the pushover they might have expected. The casualties they had suffered, while manageable within their overall force structure, indicated that the final assault on Kyushu would be more costly than their continental campaigns had led them to anticipate. As the blood-stained fleet prepared for the next phase of their invasion, both sides understood that the preliminary phase was ending. Tsushima and Iki had been testing grounds where tactical innovations were developed and psychological foundations were established. The real battle for Japan was about to begin on the beaches of Kyushu, where the full military might of the island nation would face the most successful invasion force in human history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Japan, but the future of an entire civilization. The isolated island culture that had never known foreign invasion was about to face its ultimate test against an empire that had conquered everything it had ever attempted to subdue. The 23rd of November marked the beginning of the final phase, as 900 Mongol warships materialized off the coast of Kyushu like harbingers of apocalypse. But this time, something fundamental had shifted in the equation of terror that had served the invaders so effectively on the smaller islands. The Japanese forces waiting on the mainland had received detailed intelligence about Mongol methods, and more crucially, they had witnessed something that changed everything. These supposedly invincible conquerors could bleed. The reports filtering back from Tsushima and Iki carried more than tales of horror and systematic brutality. Hidden within the accounts of massacre and mutilation were tactical details that revealed weaknesses in the Mongol war machine. Japanese commanders studying these reports discovered that the explosive devices, while terrifying, had limited range and required time to reload. The coordinated archery volleys, though devastating, created brief windows of vulnerability during repositioning. Most importantly, the psychological warfare tactics that had proven so effective against isolated garrisons might lose their power when facing defenders who knew exactly what to expect. The beaches of Hakata Bay presented a vastly different tactical situation than anything the Mongols had encountered in their island-hopping campaign. Unlike the exposed shores of Tsushima and Iki, these coastlines had been transformed into fortress complexes during the 7 years since Kublai Khan's first diplomatic overtures. Stone walls 2 meters high stretched for kilometers along the waterfront, punctuated by archer towers and reinforced gates that could channel any assault into carefully prepared killing zones. But the most significant change wasn't architectural, it was psychological. The Japanese forces gathering at Hakata weren't isolated garrison troops facing impossible odds in hopeless situations. They were the concentrated military might of an entire nation, supported by supply lines, reinforcements, and the knowledge that retreat meant the complete destruction of everything they held sacred. For the first time since beginning their invasion, the Mongols would face defenders who had nowhere to run and every reason to fight with desperate fury. The landing began with the now familiar bombardment of explosive devices, but the stone fortifications absorbed the impact far better than wooden structures or open terrain. The horrific human decorations adorning the Mongol ships still carried their intended psychological message, but Japanese defenders who had spent days preparing for this moment found their terror tempered by cold rage. These weren't unknown victims from distant islands. Some of the suspended corpses were recognizable faces, people who had fled from Tsushima and Iki only to be captured during their desperate escape attempts. What followed challenged every assumption both sides had developed about this conflict. The Mongols expected another systematic slaughter, perhaps delayed by better fortifications, but ultimately following the same pattern that had brought them victory across 2 continents. Instead, they encountered resistance that adapted to their methods in real time, learning from each tactical exchange and developing countermeasures that neutralized their traditional advantages. The systematic brutality unleashed at Tsushima had achieved its intended purpose, but it had also created something the Mongols never anticipated: a Japanese military culture forged in the fires of absolute necessity. The 80 samurai who died on that blood-soaked beach had bought more than time with their lives. They had purchased knowledge, tactical intelligence that would transform isolated island warriors into coordinated defenders capable of making the world's most successful conquerors pay an unprecedented price for every meter of conquered soil. The horror of Tsushima became the foundation upon which Japanese resistance would be built, proving that sometimes the most devastating defeats can plant seeds of eventual victory. In the end, the Mongols had taught Japan how to wage total war, a lesson that would echo through centuries of conflict yet to come.